Claudia.
Great to see you again.
Great to see you.
So, you've been a neuroscientist for almost, what, 30 something years?
30 plus years.
Oh. It was very new discipline when you started, right?
Yes, in fact, when I first started graduate school, there was no neuroscience. The first meeting of the Society for Neuroscience, which is the world's major scientific organization, was first started, the first meeting was in 1974, which was actually after I began graduate school. So neuroscience really started when I was a student.
Wow. Well, that's another conversation. What made you go there? But you told me the other day something that it really shocked me, that 97% of the funds that go to study the brain go to the pathologies, to the unhealthy mind, and only 3% go to healthy minds. That's quite impressive.
Yes, it's quite a shocking figure. The major body that funds biomedical scientific research in the United States is the National Institutes of Health. And I joke around with my students and say that it really should be called the National Institutes of Disease, because it is focused almost exclusively on illness. And so the World Health Organization has a definition of health where they specifically talk about the fact that health is not simply the absence of illness, but it involves psychological factors like well-being and even spiritual components. And so I think it's really important that there be a dedicated effort that is focused on health and healthy minds that is different from the focus on illness.
So in your research of the healthy mind, what is it that you have found in terms of what is the physiology of well-being and what is the expression of that well-being? What have you encountered?
Well, there's been an extensive corpus of neuroscientific research over the last 10 years in particular. And from that work, we've been able to identify 4 major underlying constituents of well-being that have been neuroscientifically validated. One of them is what we call resilience, but it's defined very specifically as the speed with which you recover from adversity, how quickly or how slowly you recover from adversity. Some people recover very slowly. So if they encounter an emotional challenge in their life, they are thrown off balance for quite some time, and it takes them a long time to settle down. Whereas other people can respond in the moment, but are able to return back to baseline very, very quickly. This difference turns out to be something that we can measure in specific brain circuits. And that measurement in these brain circuits predicts many different aspects of well-being. And so this is something really important. And the other thing that's important about this is that these are circuits that exhibit plasticity. So they can change in response to experience and also in response to training. So the second component of well-being is positive outlook. And that refers to the extent to which we look at the world in a more positive way, a more optimistic way. It refers to the idea that some people can see other people and see within them the seeds of well-being, see within them kindness and compassion at their core, even if they may not be behaving that way. And the ability to see another person in that way.
Or in a situation.
Or in a situation, and understand that while they may be acting in a way which is not necessarily the most helpful, that they're trying to do their best given what they know, because human beings are built to want to be happy and to avoid suffering. And so the ability to regard another person in that way is something that can promote well-being in oneself and also well-being in others. The third constituent of well-being, from a neuroscientific perspective, is attention. We don't normally think of attention as a component of well-being, but to paraphrase a recent study, a wandering mind is an unhappy mind. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that people who have a more distracted attentional style and who are pulled by one thing and another and can't focus their attention report being much less happy and showing lower levels of well-being. And so this too is instantiated in a circuit in the brain that exhibits plasticity, and it can change in response to experience. And if we train this circuit, it can actually improve, not unlike training a muscle or engaging in other kinds of physical exercise. The last constituent of well-being that's been investigated neuroscientifically is probably the most important, and that's generosity. Because generosity really gets these circuits in the brain activated very, very quickly. There is a growing body of neuroscientific evidence to show that the easiest way to activate these circuits in the brain is through acts of generosity, actually being kind to others. Kindness, caring for others. And that turns out to be a kind of double positive benefit because it's helpful to the other person and also it brings well-being to ourselves. And each of these four constituents is based in a specific brain circuit that we've learned a lot about, and every one of these circuits shows plasticity. Some of the circuits can change more easily than others, but they all can change in response to experience and training.
And these are kind of roads within the brain that go from one part of the brain to other.
Yes, they are.
They connect different parts of the brain.
They are circuits, meaning that they include connections from one part of the brain to another. And the nature of those connections turns out to be extremely important. So it's not that kindness or generosity is located in any one place in the brain. It's distributed. And the connections between the areas that are important for kindness or generosity turn out to be extremely important.
So will that have to do with connecting different hemispheres of the brain, anything like that, or that's something different?
The connection between the hemispheres of the brain may be related to some aspects of this, but not to all.
Okay.
Yeah.
So given that it's such a complex theme, the well-being of the brain, where, or the mind, the healthy mind, where should we pay attention as educators, our parents? Where is the most beneficial? Maybe you just said it, with caring.
Well, I think there are two components that are really beneficial that should be targets of our educational curricula and interventions. One of them is attention, because attention is the building block for all other forms of learning. If a child or an adult is not paying attention to what's happening in his or her environment, then it's going to impede the ability to learn everything. And so attention is such a core building block of everything else. And if there's one thing we know about plasticity in the brain, it's that attention can be educated. Attention can be trained, as William James inferred in his great tome, The Principles of Psychology in 1890. Attention, the education of attention would be the education par excellence. And it really, from the modern research, we know that it can be trained. The second piece that I think is kind of the low-hanging fruit is generosity or caring, because that is something that I think we all come into the world with a predisposition to express. And we need the right kind of environment to nurture that predisposition. But I believe that it is in our core. It's part of who we are as human beings. And there's more and more evidence to suggest that we come into the world with this innate bias for caring. And we need the right kind of environment to nurture it. But because it's part of our innate core, modern research, including some work that we've done, shows that you don't need much training to prime these circuits in the brain. They can become expressed pretty easily with really modest amounts of training. Less than 10 hours is sufficient to produce a measurable change in the brain.
Related to caring?
Yes, related.
To make somebody start to care about others or itself.
To facilitate the caring of others in particular, and to actually change behavior and the brain in ways that promote this kind of generosity is something that...
And the reward is an inner reward.
Exactly, it's an inner reward, but we know that it activates parts of the brain that are associated with enjoyment, deep kind of contentment. And so, the Dalai Lama talks about the best way to be happy is to be kind toward others. And it turns out that modern neuroscientific evidence actually is consistent with that.
So, the relating to also attention and activating the brain and the well-being, you were saying before that the brain is not just up here, but has a relationship with the rest of the body.
Yeah, this is really an important issue. Sometimes neuroscientists treat the brain as if it's disembodied. But the fact is that there are these extensive, massive, bidirectional highways that exist between the brain and the body. And so we know from really good epidemiological data, the best data of this kind comes from the UK, where there have been extensive studies in large samples of British civil servants. And we know that from these studies, people who report higher levels of well-being are actually physically healthier. We do not know the precise mechanisms that give rise to that association, but the fact of that association is beyond question. And so these circuits in the brain that are critical for well-being communicate with the body. They regulate the immune system, the endocrine system, the autonomic nervous system, all of which play a role in physical health. And also the connections go the opposite way. So if there's a problem in the body, it can actually impact the brain and modulate the function of the brain. We also know that certain kinds of physical training can have beneficial effects on the brain. And so it goes in both directions, and this is something really important.
So what have you learned about strategies or approaches? Of course, we are always advocate for art and creativity. We can talk about that. But what else have you learned about what helps or what contributes to develop healthy minds?
Well, one of the things that is so important, and this actually is where the arts, I think, do come in, is from basic neuroscientific research, we know that awareness is a critical ingredient for promoting transformation and change. In order to cultivate well-being, to change one's habits of mind toward healthier habits of mind, being aware of one's emotions, being aware of what's happening in one's body and one's mind is critically important. And one of the critical steps to develop awareness is to have some kind of way to represent what's going on in our minds and our bodies. And for some people, it's very difficult to represent this in words. And in fact, these experiences are not verbal experiences to begin with. And so even if we could represent them in words, it would lose something in the translation. And so for many people, being able to represent what is going on in one's mind and one's body through artistic media can be a really crucial mode for facilitating transformation. And we know that from sort of first principles of basic neuroscientific research. And this is something that we've become deeply interested in large part inspired by you, Claudia, and what you've been doing. And we are evaluating now the impact of including specific arts activities in curricula that we've developed that are secular contemplative curricula to examine the added value of having arts activities as an alternative mode of expression. And it may be particularly important for certain kinds of people. And so part of this research is to see if we can determine which kinds of people may be particularly benefited from these alternative modes of expression.
And why would you say it's so critical to be able to, for the well-being and a healthy mind, to be able to name your emotions, to express your inner states? Why is it so important to actually express and communicate and share that, or bring them out of yourself?
Well, in part, one answer to the question is this. There's a lot of emotional information that's continuously impinging upon us as we walk about the world. Our worlds are just, particularly our interpersonal worlds, are just full of emotion. Most of those cues we're actually not aware of by definition. But yet they affect our brains. And when those brain circuits are impacted, they change our brains, they change our bodies in ways that we may not be aware of or maybe just peripherally aware of. Being able to become aware of them, to represent them in some way, including through the arts, is the first and probably most important step in being able to transform them. Mm-hmm. Without awareness, they will just
take control of yourself.
That's right. They'll automatically activate circuits in the brain and the body in a way that we're not aware of.
And we cannot control them, we cannot manage them, we cannot deal with them.
Exactly. And so the invitation in this work, really what lies at the center of it, is awareness. I think that the arts can help tremendously in facilitating that kind of awareness because it provides a mode of expression that is non-linguistic.
Right.
And that, I think, is really crucial.
To deal with this world, to deal with this inner world. And also in that, we were talking about the importance of framing, it's a way of interpretation mm-hmm. of your inner experience, whether it's an emotion or a situation that you lived in the past. It could be long in the past or not so long in the past, and how the framing or the narrative that we create around this experience actually affects our brain, and how changing the story can change our brains and therefore our lives.
Yes, this is huge. I mean, really huge, because there is now a growing body of serious neuroscientific research on what neuroscientists have called reappraisal. So changing one's interpretation of a narrative or of input that's coming in, some event that's occurring, and being able to reframe it, to reappraise it, can change the brain very, very quickly. We can see these changes occurring in a matter of minutes. We can give a person an instruction to reframe an experience and see a change within a few minutes. Doesn't mean the change will last, but it really shows how easy it is to alter the reframing and to change the brain, at least temporarily. And then if we repeat it over time, practice reframing it, then we can actually change the narrative in a way that's enduring. And that will change the brain in a way that also produces enduring change.
Do you have any particular example? You were sharing one about somebody.
Yeah, so the narrative around self is particularly important, because one of the primary causes of suffering is the narrative around the self. And in the West, many people have problems with self-concept, self-esteem, and they have a negative narrative about themselves. And so if they perform not as good as they want to, say on an exam or giving a talk or in some performance activity, some people are prone to fall back on a narrative about their self and attribute it to the fact that they're just no good, that they're not very smart, and they carry this narrative around. And one of the ways that we can help people reframe this is to understand that these are just thoughts and to see them as just thoughts. And we can help a person to change her or his relationship with this narrative. And then what happens over time is that the narrative begins to change as their experience changes. And so we know that when we help a person reframe an experience of this kind, it has a dramatic effect on the brain and can happen very quickly. This can also have an effect on the body. And then a person, because they experience this differently, they begin to shift their narrative. And so it no longer is...
And their life with that.
Exactly. And their life. So this, I think, is really powerful.
Really profound. But that has to do with something you mentioned before, which is a mental habit. Transforming our emotional and mental habits.
Yes, and so I think that the notion of a mental habit is really core to all of this. And the simple kinds of training and practices that we and other scientists have been investigating are really meant to provide people with simple tools that they can use every day of their life and sprinkle their daily life with this in a way that is similar to the way people use physical exercise today. And so our vision is that at some point in the not too distant future, 15 years from now, people will regard mental exercise in the same way they regard physical exercise today. And they will see this as an important part of their personal hygiene, a kind of self-care for the mind and the brain. And it turns out that we can shape our brains in ways that are more intentional using these simple habits. And it doesn't take much. One of the things that I'm often asked is how much practice do we need? And the research shows that even short amounts of practice, if it's done regularly over time, is sufficient to produce a measurable change in the brain.
So with everything that you're saying, Richie, it really makes me think that we are living in a kind of a shift of understanding the potential of the mind and a shift in understanding us as humans and what's possible. It's like if when we were born we had an idea of our potential and now it has completely exploded.
I think that we are on the inflection point of a major tipping point. And I think that the scientific research has played an important role in underscoring this notion of plasticity. And one of the amazing things that's happening now in the biological sciences is it's not just neuroplasticity, but it's also genomic plasticity. We're learning that unlike a kind of Newtonian view of genetics that we were taught as students, it's true that we're all born with a fixed complement of base pairs, that's our DNA, but what we've learned is that the extent to which genes are turned on and turned off is tremendously variable and is modifiable by experience. And so this opens up just totally new worlds. There have been studies, for example, of identical twins who have been raised from birth and studied over the course of time from birth. And it turns out that as the identical twins develop and begin to have experiences that are unique to each of the individuals, they begin to show more and more difference in their epigenetic patterns. So although their DNA is the same, the extent to which different genes are turned on and turned off begins to radically differ as they become older and older and have more and more unique experiences. And so this simply underscores this notion that our genes are much more dynamic than we once thought as well.
Whoa, that's huge. That's a whole new paradigm that we can, in our lifetime, transform our genetic information.
It is. And it's not just in our lifetime. There's new data now showing, which was heresy just 5 years ago, showing this is really hard-nosed scientific evidence published in the very best journals in the world. This is not fringe science, showing that these epigenetic changes can actually be passed down to the next generation, at least for 2 generations. And so it's wild. I mean, it's a whole new world.
And given the moments, the complex moment that we're living now with the complexity of the state of the planet and population and all of what we know of violence, how do you think that these understanding and paradigms about who we are as humans can contribute to transform the path, the current path of humanity?
Well, I think that that it is already having some beneficial effect. I think that while there is a lot of violence in the world, if you actually look at the hard data, and this has been looked at, and you go back in history and then look at the historical trends over time, violence is actually going down, not up, and the data for that are very, very clear. We also know that the news media amplifies the bad things, but there are many more acts of kindness that occur every day than acts of violence. We hear about the acts of violence because that's what the news media focuses on, but the acts of kindness can fill many more news channels if they focused on that. And so I think that there is the beginning of a recognition that the way things are working now is not sustainable, and that if we go back to who we are as human beings and remind ourselves and become more familiar with the nature of our own minds, that this will help a lot. And I think that I think the scientific evidence is really important. I don't think it's sufficient. And I think we need to be partnering with like-minded organizations to be part of a movement. And I think we are part of a movement. And the movement can be summarized, in my view, very simply, and that is to change the cultural meme around the idea that well-being and positive qualities of mind can be learned and can be cultivated. And I think that there is a growing recognition that this is the case and that we need to act on this. We have a moral obligation to take this seriously and to do everything we can to nurture these qualities in every sphere of society.
Perfect. That's wonderful. And how are we going to do that? Together.
We are.
Yeah.
We're starting.
We're starting, and we will.
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Richie.